Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going. As I like to point out, each and every day, it expands our base. We are going to speak this morning about the Supreme Court, among other issues. But I want to remind you we have question and answers in the last half of this podcast every Friday. And we will do it again today. Many of you with questions, and we will try to deal with as many as we can. I am going to tell you now that we're going to deal with the serious question of J.D. Vance's comments about Richard Nixon. I think it's an important question and one that we will address right here on Around the Political World with John Rothman. But let me begin with the United States Supreme Court. Every president has a dream of making the Supreme Court over in his image. And that is precisely what Donald Trump has done. With the conservative majority on the court, Donald Trump has been able to achieve something that is the envy of almost every president. And I want to begin with two major decisions yesterday. They were 6-3 decisions. We'll deal with another decision that was not 6-3, which also has impact. But let's talk about it. First, the question of temporary protected status, TPS, which has been granted to two groups primarily in recent years, the Syrians and the Haitians, people of color. And I want to point out to you that this is a serious question because Stephen Miller in the White House and others in the administration have spoken directly about America being a white nation. That's right, a white nation. This harks back to another period in our history. And I want you to take away the term Syrian and Haitian. And I want you to substitute the names of Jews, Irish, Italians. That's right, because in a period of the 20th century, and yes, the 19th century, there were people who said America is a white country, and we should exclude Irish, Italians, Jews, because they're not really white. And you may recall the great debate which took place over immigration during those days. It's important to remember it because although the Supreme Court rejected the notion that color applied to the decisions by the court on the Syrians and the Haitians, there can be little doubt based on what the administration itself has said and what the President of the United States has said, that this, in fact, plays a critical role. The decision by the court is a 6-3 decision. And we know that the six conservatives have decided to go along with the Trump administration policies. And that, to me, is an indication of a danger. By the way, the same danger was pointed to during the days of the Warren Court, when the court was clearly tilted left, right? No, not really. On the Warren Court were Democrats and Republicans, people who were liberals and conservatives. And yet they were able to arrive at positions which became mainstream in our country. These issues today are extremely divisive, and the Supreme Court decision, frankly, is a partisan political statement. But that's not all. The High Court issued another ruling, a ruling that I found particularly significant. It was a 7-2 decision dealing with Roundup, the chemical which causes cancer. The Supreme Court sided with the maker of Roundup weed killer in a ruling expected to block, and listen to this, thousands of lawsuits alleging it failed to warn people the product could cause cancer. We know that's true, right? Scientifically, we know it's true. But we also know that the case came before the court after a tidal wave of litigation that included some, well, very peculiar statements. Let's be clear. The decision is a victory for President Donald Trump's administration, which argued in support of the company Bayer that produces Roundup. And I've got to tell you, we should be outraged. This 7-2 ruling held that Roundup cannot be sued in state courts for failure to warn because, listen to this, federal regulators found a cancer link unlikely and do not require a warning label. What? You could have said the same thing about cigarettes, right? And yet we know that this is tough. Now, I want you to know that the Bayer CEO, Bill Anderson, said, "This decision is good for American farmers who help feed the world. It provides the regulatory clarity necessary for innovators like us to develop the agricultural tools that guarantee an affordable food supply." But we know that Roundup causes cancer. And yet the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't go to court to deal with this subject. The same thing applies on the immigration question. We know that there is a serious failure that has taken place. And I wanted to point this out because we wanted to believe, and I want to believe, that the Supreme Court of the United States makes judgment based on fact. And this, my friends, was a real blow to the third co-equal branch of government. We now have an executive empowered, a legislative branch impotent, and the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, making decisions which were unthinkable just a while ago. There is something to be said, my friends, about the simple statement that I have made in every election in which I've covered for me, and that is that when we elect a president, we also elect a Supreme Court. That is to say, we decide the fate of decisions in advance. And this bothers me terribly. This is even tougher because Bayer said the ruling should result in the dismissal of failure to warn lawsuits. The company said it plans to proceed with a proposed, they're going to offer $7.25 billion in a class action settlement intended to resolve many of the remaining claims. What? Either it's true or it isn't true. The ruling has been denounced by environmental groups, lawyers representing people who have been harmed by Roundup, and I can only tell you that a lawyer for those who were involved in all of this said the Supreme Court ruling wrongly slams the courthouse door on Americans sickened by pesticides. The lawyer, whose name is Christopher Seeger, is 100% correct. Isn't the point of the Supreme Court to stand up for people who need relief? The fact that this court has ruled this way should disturb every American. Now, let me explain to you that I've been criticized before for saying that when the Supreme Court speaks, it's the law of the land. Remember Bush v. Gore? I didn't like the decision, but I went along with it. And I must tell you, I don't like these decisions. And the only answer is to once again have a president of the United States who nominates people to the Supreme Court who really consider the law. This is a disgrace. and something which we need to address in political campaigns. Roundup is displayed on store shelves all across America, and the Bayer Company disputes that it is a pesticide that causes cancer. Let me remind you that the tobacco companies raised the same objection when the decision was made that on every pack of cigarettes there had to be a warning label. I must tell you, as disturbed as I am by the decisions dealing with the question of temporary protected status, as upset as I am about the decision on guns, again, a 6-3 decision in which the ruling says that guns will now be available even when they're banned from certain spaces. It is, to me, a misreading of the law. It is, to me, the wrong decision by this court. All we can do to change it is to change presidents and to hope that the next president of the United States will have better sense than this court. Boy, books are going to be written about it. I was asked by Jillian whether or not I believe that Franklin Roosevelt was right in his court backing in 1937. Should the court be packed? And the answer is no, because a conservative or a liberal can pack a court. It's the same thing when some suggested that the number of justices on the court be adjusted now in order to change the balance. No. We have a system. And although the system is imperfect, the answer is not the correction of the court. The answer is the correction on who is president of the United States. Those of you who have listened to me over the years know that I have often said and will say again that when we vote for a president, we really vote for the shape of the court. And that means we have to think about it before we cast our ballots. Will the American people react to these decisions? Will people of color react to a Supreme Court which clearly did not have the interests of people of color at heart? And what about the fact that if this had happened to Italians or Irish or Jews, we would have had, well, a whole different country? I'm asking these questions because we'd better ask them, and we'd better have answers. I want to address one more thing while we're at it, and that is the White House believes that the Strait of Hormuz is wide open. I have news for them. The Iranians are still launching missiles, projectiles, and we know what happened yesterday. There is no doubt in my mind that the Trump policy has failed, and we will address that in question and answers as well. Let us simply point out that with the United States inflation rate now up, and you all know it is up, the administration is looking for vehicles to carry an election in November. And that includes an assault on the democratic processes. These are matters of grave concern, and to address them in just a few minutes is not fair or just. But we do it because that's what we've decided to do, and I want your comments on this. I think it's really important. I want to remind you that this podcast is made possible by the fact that all of you listen and comment. I want to thank you for tuning in to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I do want to hear your thoughts on today's episode. You can write a review on Apple Podcast, drop a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and click any of the links in the show notes to connect with me on social media. I want to point out we are now going to go into question and answers. By the way, please remember to share this episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand, which of course is our goal. And this show has been getting so much positive attention that we're excited to bring on additional advertising sponsors. It's good for the show, it expands our base, and we hope you appreciate the fact that it indicates the great success that we are having. I want to immediately proceed to the question and answer section, and we have a lot to talk about. Tim asks, what do you predict will happen if Democrats take the House and Senate in the election? The answer is there will be investigations into Donald Trump and his administration. Will there be an impact? No. You could, if you had a Democratic majority in the House, impeach the president, but if we've learned twice with Donald Trump, unless you have the votes in the Senate, it doesn't mean anything. This comes from Rob. Consider the large majorities requiring documentary proof of citizenship. If the concern is disenfranchising eligible voters, how do you overcome that hurdle? The answer is we don't have massive voter fraud in this country. It is a delusion which has been offered by Donald Trump. And so it's a problem which doesn't need to have an answer. And this comes from Rob. You've called the new Iran deal a Munich deal. That, supporters say, is actually tougher than the Obama administration. Can you comment on that? The answer is, of course, the Trump deal is a fake deal. It's not tougher. And actually, you can see it every day. Do you see a ceasefire in the Strait of Hormuz? Do you see a ceasefire in Lebanon? Do you see recognition of Israel's right to exist as a nation? No. Okay, the nuclear question is a serious question, but between the United States and Israel, the facilities have basically been destroyed. So, what's the danger here? And you and I understand the danger continues when billions of dollars are transferred to Iran. And that's exactly what Trump is proposing. $300 billion. No, there's no question. This is a weak deal. It is a Munich. It is a surrender. But now I want to deal with the one subject that I really feel compelled to talk about today. J.D. Vance appeared at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, promoting his new book. And he said this, that the deep state went after Nixon, and now they're after Trump. He described Watergate as a 12-hour scandal. That's right. And that it was crazy, he said, to take down a president over Watergate. I feel compelled to talk about this in this question and answer session. I worked for Richard Nixon. Much of what I am today is because of the service I gave to the president. I believe in many ways Richard Nixon was a great president. The opening to China, détente with Russia, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the war against cancer. One could go down the list of things that Richard Nixon did that are admirable. And make no mistake, I am proud of the fact that I worked for Richard Nixon. But I'm not proud of everything that Richard Nixon did as president. And let's talk for a minute about J.D. Vance's idea that it was the deep state that went after Nixon. Nonsense. Nixon was brought down by his own hubris. He could have destroyed the tapes. The evidence of his malfeasance would have been eliminated, but he didn't. He believed in presidential power and the ability of a president to protect his own papers without any question. And of course, that was not what the law determined. And in a 8-0 decision, with one recusal, the United States Supreme Court said Nixon had to release the tapes because it would prove his guilt or his innocence. Nixon wasn't brought down by the deep state, Mr. Vice President. Nixon was brought down by his own actions. And if you don't believe me, just listen to the interview he did with David Frost. He says that he brought himself down. He gave his enemies the sword and they thrust it into him. All you have to do is listen to what Nixon said himself in the Frost interviews. But what bothers me about this, and the reason I'm happy to address the issue, is because we cannot whitewash the good and the evil. I want to be clear. I believe Richard Nixon did a brilliant job as President of the United States on so many levels. But in his own words, he sure screwed it up. He screwed it up because of his own hubris. And that, to me, is the key in the Trump administration as well. When J.D. Vance suggests that the deep state went after Nixon and now they're going after Trump, he just doesn't understand the American political process. The deep state is not after Donald Trump. It is Donald Trump's own hubris, his own errors, his own malfeasance, which has brought about the criticism of Donald Trump. And the question of presidential authority. I would commend J.D. Vance to read the key Watergate tapes. I would suggest that he listen to the Frost interviews with Nixon. It's 1 hour dealing with Watergate. I would suggest that he read the books surrounding the case, including the book by Leon Jaworski, dealing with what he discovered. Jaworski was a conservative Democrat, a Lyndon Johnson friend and ally, who was put in charge of the Watergate investigation after Archibald Cox was fired, after Elliot Richardson left, after Bill Ruckelshaus left. I want you to understand, ladies and gentlemen, my concern about this, because what it means is that there is an attempt by the Trump administration to rewrite history, to rewrite the history of Richard Nixon and Watergate. Let me explain, it was not a 12-hour scandal. Those of us who lived through Watergate know that it was day after day, issue after issue. And it wasn't just the Watergate break-in. It wasn't just the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's office. It wasn't just the creation of the plumbers unit. It wasn't just the plotting that went on in the Oval Office with Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon, John Dean. I suggest that J.D. Vance read John Dean's books, particularly Blind Ambition. To understand what happened in Watergate is to understand how the American system worked. I want to remind everybody, the courts worked, the press worked, the Congress worked, and indeed, in the end, the executive branch worked. And may I tell you, by comparison to Donald Trump, Richard Nixon is a saint. Nixon didn't pardon people who attacked our system. Remember what Donald Trump did in pardoning or granting clemency to all of those that assaulted the Capitol in the insurrection on January 6th. Let me point out that Nixon did not grant amnesty or clemency to his closest allies and friends. I even remember, and you should too, that prior to his resignation, when he had the full powers of the presidency, Bob Haldeman suggested that Nixon pardon all of those involved in Watergate and that Nixon even pardon himself. When Gerald Ford, who I believe was an exceptionally honest man, chose to pardon Richard Nixon, he did so, and by the way, Nixon accepted the pardon, and a statement was composed under his name which admitted that he failed. There is something to be said for recognizing history. And what I am really disturbed about, what bothers me more than anything else, is that the Trump administration seems to deny history. In fact, there is no such thing as a secret state. There are people in the administrations, whatever they may be, with agendas. But that's not a secret state. A secret state implies a diabolical plot to control who we are and where we're going, similar to the protocols of the Elders of Zion or the Masonic plots that have been credited to that movement over many years. All of it was nonsense, rubbish. And J.D. Vance has a good shot at being president of the United States of America. His statements about Watergate and Richard Nixon, the idea that it was a 12-hour scandal, absolutely ridiculous. But I do want you to know that J.D. Vance said something that I think is true. He admires Richard Nixon. So do I. I don't admire him for his faults. I admire him for the great things he did and the great things he tried to do. The Trump administration has succeeded in something that the Nixon administration failed to implement. And that was and is the consolidation of presidential power in the White House. The author of a book called The Plot That Failed describes vividly Nixon's intent to bring all of executive branch functions into the White House so that the president could control all aspects of his administration. That plot failed then, but is succeeding now. And that, to me, is a great American tragedy. The idea that the plot that failed under Nixon is succeeding under Trump should disturb each and every American. I have given, perhaps, an overlong response to this bit of news, but I believe it is important to point it out, to say it clearly. I am no enemy of Richard Nixon. I worked for Richard Nixon. I admire much of what Richard Nixon did. I am someone who believes, however, in truth. You can't cover up scandal. And what this administration is trying to do is just that. And what J.D. Vance said when he said the deep state went after Nixon, now they're going after Trump, when he talked about Watergate being a 12-hour scandal, I can only tell you that it isn't crazy to take down a president when a president has done something wrong. Richard Nixon was brought down by his own words, his own actions, not by the deep state. And let's be perfectly clear, if I can use that expression. Donald Trump, when you compare him to Richard Nixon, has committed graver crimes against this nation than Richard Nixon did. And if we had a Republican Party that could stand up as Barry Goldwater and Hugh Scott, the Republican leader in the Senate, and John Rhodes, the Republican leader in the House, stood up to Richard Nixon, we'd be a lot better off. May I suggest, J.D. Vance, if this is your vision of the Republican Party, if this is your vision of the future of the American presidency, particularly if you occupy it, may I say I am deeply concerned. All Americans should be concerned. And that, my friends, is the simple truth. Your questions are always welcomed on Friday. I'm delighted to have answered some of them today. Many more came in, but we do our best to deal with these questions and answers every single Friday. I am John Rothman. You are listening to Around the Political World with John Rothman, and I want to say a special thank you because it deserves to be said. And this thank you is not to Gogo Zoger, because the person who compiled these questions is Jocelyn, and she is the studio podcast marketing intern who has been used for today. So Jocelyn, I want to acknowledge you and Gogo. Thank you so much. I am John Rothman. You are listening to Around the Political World with John Rothman. Can't wait to see what happens this weekend on so many different levels, but we'll be back on Monday with more. Have a great weekend. See you Monday.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.